This section is all about Azure SQL, a cloud-based relational database. I'll start by detailing the common different Azure SQL deployment options. After that, I'll show you how to create an Azure SQL Server and an Azure SQL database with different types of authentication. You will learn how to connect to it from your local development environment and from a tool Microsoft provides to manage databases, Azure Data Studio. Then we will connect our existing API to the created database, and we will learn how to deploy it and ensure that the app service can securely connect to the database. I will also cover the safest option to do that, managed identities. Let's dive in. So, what is Azure SQL? Well, it's a cloud-based database service by Microsoft. Simply put, instead of using your own local SQL Server instance, you're going to use one that's deployed on Azure. But it's not that simple, really. There's a lot of ways to do that. You could create a virtual machine and install SQL Server on that. That would also mean that your databases live on that SQL Server on that virtual machine. That will work, but as we learned in the beginning of the course, those virtual machines are an IaaS or Infrastructure as a Service offering. That means that you don't really get all the cloud benefits you can get with that option, as there is still a lot you need to manage yourself. However, it is a good option when you really need operating system level control and access. Another option is using a SQL Server managed instance. In this option, the SQL Server itself is managed by Azure. This is a PaaS or Platform as a Service offering. It includes all the typical benefits that come from not having to manage the virtual machine with the SQL Server installed on it. But you do get instance scoped feature access, which means you can still configure that SQL Server managed instance in detail. The third option is the SQL database option. This too is a Platform as a Service offering. So you still have all the benefits that typically come with it, but in this case it's not only the operating system that's abstracted away. The SQL Service instance itself is also abstracted away. Note that this doesn't mean that you won't see a SQL Server instance being deployed. It's still there, you can still access it, and you can still partially configure it. But you don't get the depth of feature configuration or options that you would with your own SQL Server managed instance option. This is the only deployment option that supports unlimited database storage, aka hyperscale. I'm going to use the SQL database option. It is, at the moment of recording, the most common and cloud-oriented one. Before we can create a new Azure SQL database, we're going to need a server. We can create such a server separately from the database, but seeing we're going to want to create a database anyway, we can also create both in one go by starting the creation process over on the portal from the SQL database resource creation. So let's choose to add a new SQL database. And let's fill out the details. It starts with a resource group. And the resource group you want to put that in, well, that depends on your resource structure strategy. It is important to note that your server and your database, or rather all databases you're going to create on that server, must be in the same resource group. I'm going to create one for our Travel Inspiration app, so I'm going to put it in our existing Travel Inspiration resource group. That being said, it is not uncommon to reuse the same server across app services, even if that means that the database will end up in a different resource group than the app service resource or other Azure resources that integrate with the database. As far as naming of the database goes, I'll simply follow the template we've used before. So appdev -SQLDB, which is the abbreviation for the SQL Server database, dev WE Travel Inspiration. Then we need to select the server to create a database on. You can go for an existing one, but as mentioned, I want it in the same resource group as the rest of my Travel Inspiration resources. I don't have such a server yet, so I'm going to create a new one. I'll name it appdev SQL for SQL Server, dev WE Travel Inspiration. And I'm going to create it in West Europe. Then we can choose the authentication methods for accessing the server. Entra only would be the safer option. But I want to show you how both work. So regular SQL authentication with username and password in a connection string and Entra ID authentication. Both for myself as an admin to log into the server and manage it, and for a managed identity to connect the Travel Inspiration API to this server. The explanation of that is coming on later on in this section. So I'll choose both. I'll set myself as the admin that can manage the server. So I select my own account. And next to that, I also create an admin login and password. Don't forget to note this info down somewhere because we'll need it afterwards. Now let's click OK. Then we need to choose the compute and service tier. First of all, I'm going to choose development as workload environment here. That already chooses a certain compute tier, but I'm going to go a little bit further and look into what we can configure here. What you choose as a service tier here is important. A SQL Server on Azure isn't the cheapest service, so be careful what you choose for testing. Let's choose to compare service tiers. There's two models you can choose from, the vCore based model and the DTU based model. The vCore based model allows you to independently choose compute and storage resources, and that gives you the most flexibility and control. The DTU, or Data Transfer Unit model, is based on a bundled measure of compute, storage and I/O resources. This is the simplest option, with pre-configured combinations. I'm going to go for this one. And I'm also going to choose the basic type here. As you can see, that brought my estimated costs per month down significantly. Let's click Apply. Up next is Backup Storage Redundancy. This defines how your backups are replicated, locally, in your zone, or across the world. I'm good with the local option for the demo. Up next, networking. I'm going to leave all of this at its default, so I can show you later on where to configure some of these things in the SQL Server Blade. This is something that needs to change, so I figured it would be a good idea to have a look at that afterwards. Same for security. Underneath server identity, you can already read something about that managed identity I mentioned a few minutes ago. But let's do that when we get here. On the next step, we can choose the collation. That should be familiar. It defines the rules that sort and compare data. I'm okay with the default here. And we can also choose when Azure should perform planned maintenance of our server. Let's also leave that at the default. We can potentially add tags as well. No need for that for now. Let's review and create. That is looking good. And there we go. This can take a while, so while that process is going on, I'll show you the commands you need to perform this same thing via the CLI. The one you're looking for are the AZ SQL Server and related commands for managing your SQL Server, and for managing the database, the AZ SQL DB and related commands can be used. And there we go. Deployment was successful. Let's see how we can connect to this from our local development environment. To be able to connect to our newly deployed database from our local development environment, the first thing we need to do is allow connections from our IP to our SQL Server. By default, this is disabled, so this is something you will probably have to do again each time you get a new local IP. What we want to do is navigate to our SQL Server instance. You can do that directly by searching for it, or you can go through the SQL database. The blade we want to open here is the networking blade. This is what we could also have configured when creating our SQL Server instance. What I want to enable is public access from my IP. So I choose Enable Public Access for selected networks, scroll down a bit and add my client IP address. Let's save this. And that should do it. Let's switch to Visual Studio. And let's open SQL Server Object Explorer and choose to create a new connection. And let's input the server name. This server name can be found on the SQL Server Blade. Let me copy that. Now let's paste it here. As far as authentication is concerned, we've got a few options. Windows Authentication is the first one. That's trying to authenticate with my local machine account. that won't work. SQL Server Authentication will work, as we've enabled that when setting up the server. Also, a multitude of Microsoft Entra ID options are available here, depending on the type of Entra ID account you connect with. I set myself as admin, and my account, as most user accounts, will be configured with a password and/or MFA setup. My account is set up with MFA, so that's the option I want to choose. But I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to start with regular, good old SQL Server Authentication. In the previous clip, we had to choose a username and password. This is where you'll need that. Let's choose to remember it. And let's open the list of databases. Here is our SQL database. Let's select that and let's click Connect. And there we go. Here's our SQL database server on Azure and our SQL database. There are no user-created tables in here yet. We still need to do that. But what we can do here is manage them from here, or manage the users, roles, and so on. All of this is possible because at SQL Server level over on Azure, we set up this SQL Authentication user as an admin. Let's disconnect. And let's try that again, but this time with my Entra ID account. So let me input the server name again, choose Microsoft Entra MFA in this case, and input my username. And when I try to select the database, I'm asked to sign in. There we go. Let's select the database and let's click Connect. And here is my database again. Now, not everyone likes working with SQL Server Object Explorer. You can of course also use good old SQL Server Management Studio, but there's another option, Azure Data Studio. Let's have a look.